Hello, my name is Nick Bentley, and I'm giving the lecture for Text and Time this week on the play The Island by Athol Fugard, John Carney, and Winston Nashona. There are my contact details if you want to get in touch to ask any questions about the lecture. Now, so far on this module, you've been looking at literature from the early modern period, the 16th century, into the 17th and 18th centuries, and then on to the 19th century and the Victorian period. For this week, we're moving into the 20th century. Now, of course, there is so much going on in the 20th century, it is difficult to summarise particular contexts. There are profound political and social changes, world wars, mass migration, and changes in the world order, alongside the decline and dismantling of those vast European empires that were built up in the 18th and 19th centuries. So instead of trying to cover all of that, we thought we would concentrate on one particular situation, on one particular context. And we are moving geographically away from Britain to South Africa. We're going to look at a particular set of social and political circumstances that were pertaining in the post-Second War period, and one literary response to them. In doing so, though, I hope we will raise some interesting questions generally about the relationship between literary texts and the immediate social and political context to which they are responding, directly responding in this case. As with the previous lectures on this module, it's divided into three mini lectures. In this first lecture one, we'll talk about the historical context in South Africa in the period across the 20th century, but especially in the post-Second World War period. We'll talk about colonialism and the apartheid system that was put in place in South Africa during that time. In the second lecture, I'll talk more about the theatrical context pertaining to The Island as a play. So I'll talk about theatre in South Africa in the 1970s generally, and more theoretical discussion about political theatre and what's often called improv theatre, improvised theatre. In the third and final lecture, we'll focus primarily on the island itself. I'll think about the structure of the play and its main themes. Now, I want to talk about the play in relation, therefore, to its historical context and also some theories as well. So I'll also refer to some theoretical contexts across the lecture. So Bertolt Brecht, Frantz Fanon, Jerzy Krotowski, and Michel Foucault in particular. Okay, so let's start to think about some of the broader historical contexts. Now, South Africa was originally a colony of the British and Dutch in the 18th and 19th centuries, part of the colonial scramble for Africa, as it was called. The Union of South Africa was a British dominion from 1910. During that period, the Natives Land Act was in place, which restricted ownership of land to white settlers only. The black population were not allowed to own land. So the system that was in place in the 1970s, the apartheid system, has a longer history, actually, and goes back to days of colonialism. Now, South Africa gained independence from Britain in 1931, but it still retained associations with Britain and retained the British monarchy in particular. After the Second World War, the National Party was elected, which indeed strengthened racial segregation. The National Party was a wide-controlled party in the country. Now, South Africa became a republic in 1961, but the post-colonial context, of course, is complicated by the ruling white European government that stayed in place after that time, after 1961. And it was during this period that the apartheid system, which is basically a system that segregated areas along racial lines and limited rights for populations of the country. During this period, there was a system of what were called pass laws, what in the play that are referred to as dumbooks. And these were black South Africans had to carry these passbooks at all times. And if they were found not to be carrying them, or if they were, if the details on them were somehow inaccurate, they could potentially be arrested. During this period, geographically, virtually all the black urban populations lived in what were called the townships. And indeed, the island is known as one of the township plays. Now, the townships were tended to be often overcrowded with excessive poverty, very poor living and health conditions, and often in sort of very poor housing and low quality dwellings generally. This is where the island was first performed, often in makeshift theatre spaces. There were, however, various resistance movements against the dominant political structures in South Africa. And again, this goes back to before the Second World War. One of these is the African National Congress, which was formed from other resistance groups in 1923 and was an outlawed political movement in South Africa. Now, the African National Congress, as you can probably tell by the title, was a kind of pan-African movement, which was driving for decolonisation. And it helped in working towards the dismantling of the colonial empires put in place in the 18th and 19th centuries by all those key major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, etc. The ANC was outlawed in South Africa after the Second World War, and there was continued political activity, however, against the apartheid system that came into place and the pass laws across this post sort of Second World War period. This came together in what was called the Defiance Campaign in the 1950s. Which was various movements which were challenging the prevailing political structures at that period. And again, during this period, the white South African government arrested many who were associated with the resistance movements. This struggle was in place and was continuing into the 1970s when the island was first performed. It was first performed in 1973. One of the contexts for this is Robben Island, of which the island refers to, not directly, but we're assumed that this is where it's taking place. Now, Robben Island was the prison in South Africa where many of those political prisoners were held, including Nelson Mandela. A little bit more then, out. There are a few images there of the political activity in South Africa during this period, both activity and the responses by the authorities, often violent responses. Just a little bit more background on Robben Island. Now, as I said, Robben Island is the prison where political prisoners were held during apartheid, and those political prisoners actively involved in resisting the regime and the apartheid system that was in place. Nelson Mandela, probably the most famous prisoner in Robben Island, was in prison there for 27 years. Also in this context is interesting to know Steve Biko, who was part of the Black Consciousness movement. And Steve Biko fought on behalf of many of those arrested and placed in the prison, doing so in 1977 when he was killed. He was arrested in 1977 and killed in police custody. Mandela was released in 1990 when the apartheid system was ended and the government control broke down in South Africa. I think that picture there that you see there is of him returning to Robben Island later on after he'd been a prisoner there for many years. Mandela, of course, became the president of South Africa in 1994. Okay, so that's the end of this first lecture. In the second lecture, I'll talk a bit more about the theatrical context behind the island, as well as theatre in South Africa in the 1970s and political theatre generally. So see you in the next lecture.